Shalom and welcome to Life Lessons. And we're in the section of Yitro that begins with chapter 18. And in this parasha, in this section, he's going to be speaking about two major things. One, the visit of Yitro that came to visit his son-in-law, Moses, and the advice that he gave him how to run and how to be the leader. And the second is, the major one is Mount Sinai, the revelation of God on Mount Sinai. And it's very interesting that these two things come together, because first we're speaking about a human being, and at that point not even Jewish, that comes to visit the desert, his son-in-law, and gives advice. And then right after that, it starts with the preparations to revelation of Mount Sinai. So I want to introduce all that is to start with a very interesting story. They say a story, there was about 100 years ago or more, lived a great sage. Then he was a young child by the name Rabbi Israel of Ruzhin. And this young Rabbi Israel, when he was studying in Cheder, in the Jewish school, they were studying in the Talmud. There's a section in the Talmud that discusses what happens if you're traveling in the desert and you forgot which day is the Sabbath. We have to understand in our days, in the world of high tech, it's probably hard to forget which day you are, but in those days, if you were traveling, it's very possible sometimes to get confused and say, what is exactly today? Because you're alone there in the desert. Is it Friday today? Is it Saturday? Now, if it is Saturday, what we call the Shabbat, and you are observant and following the Jewish laws, then you're not allowed to travel. You have to stop and camp wherever you are and wait till the Sabbath is over. And that also involves some positive commandments, making kiddush on wine, the prayers. So knowing when Sabbath is, when Saturday is very important in the Jewish tradition. So Talmud discusses what happens. Somebody's traveling, he doesn't know. And the Talmud goes into a discussion that bottom line is you're going to count 6 days and you're going to stop on the 7th, and regardless, because to remember the concept of the 7th day, and then when you come to a place that you do know, you go back to normal count. So when they were learning, the teacher saw that this kid, he was then a kid, he's a little bit disturbed. He says, what's the matter? Why you can't follow? You don't understand? So he says, yeah, I don't understand something. How's it possible that you could forget when Sabbath is? How could you forget? Kid had a hard time understanding, so he tried to explain to the teacher, listen, you're traveling, you're alone, you don't have a calendar with you, it could happen. Kid says, no, I don't see how that could happen. The teacher turns to him and says, so well, maybe you could help me out. What happens? You're traveling, you got no calendar, you're in the desert, nobody else with you, and there's a lot going on. So how do you know? And all of a sudden you're confused about a certain date. What is it? How do you know? So the kid says, what's the problem? You look up on the sky and you know it's the Sabbath. You're supposed to feel the day of the Sabbath different. Automatically. That was from this young kid's perspective that later on turned to be a great sage. Now in our section today, talks about the 10 Commandments, where we know that the commandment number 4 is about keeping the Sabbath. Now, it's important to understand that this concept, this idea that automatically spiritual things should have an effect on us and we should be able to recognize it and to live by it, that's a phenomena that was created by the revelation of God on Mount Sinai. And this is a very important point, because they explain us anything that happened before the revelation of Mount Sinai. Yes, if a person is going to do something spiritual, possible, but not necessarily has an effect on the physical level. When you, in our days, for example, based as a direct connection from Mount Sinai, what happened on Mount Sinai, for example, we call certain things holy. The Torah in the parchment, that's what's behind me here in the ark, is considered holy. What does it mean in Judaism, holy sometimes? Holy means is you're not allowed to let it fall on the floor. You have to treat it with respect. It's a holy object. And then we start thinking ourselves, but how does a parchment become holy? A parchment is a materialistic thing. Or the prayer shawl that we wear sometimes on the morning around our head and our body, what's known as the talit. How does that become holy? Or you take the lighting candles Friday evening, a piece of candle, you go to the store, buy a candle, this candle has no holiness to it whatsoever, and all of a sudden, you make a blessing, blessed are you God that commanded us to sanctify the holy Sabbath. That moment, that candle became holy. You sanctified that candle. And this question is a real question, because a lot of times in our minds, we may dream about spiritual things, and maybe we talk about spiritual things, but because we're so materialistic, since we're human beings and we live on earth in this world, it's sometimes very hard for us to understand or comprehend something spiritual. It's easy sometimes for us to point the finger and say, oh, you see that individual? They seem to be more spiritual. But a lot of times if you think about it, it's just talk. What does it mean, more spiritual? More spiritual means that you're bringing more divine, more godliness into your day-by-day life. And what we are talking about today is not only you bringing more spirituality, we transform. We take something that it is mundane and we elevate it that it should become holy. This is really, in a deeper sense, what's going on here in the whole story of the Ten Commandments, and even as we're soon going to see in the advice of Yitro. The Medrash, one of the books on the commentators on the Torah, says, imagine as a king, there were two countries, and there's no relationship between them whatsoever. Not only this, it says the people from Rome shouldn't go visit the people from Syria. The people from Syria shouldn't go visit the people from Rome. Total disconnection. I wouldn't advise in our days to go visit Syria, but that's a side story. However, then the decree falls apart and everyone is allowed to go visit each other. So it says, in a way, view that as it will be the spiritual and the physical. Those are two different worlds. And many times there's no connection whatsoever. The only reason why there's a connection is because God said so. And God said so, so He gave us the power to do that. So He gave us the power that we could take a simple bread, elevate it, and all of a sudden becomes holy because we're going to use it for the Shabbat meal. And the candle, a physical thing, is going to become holy. And many other things like this. So this idea to use things that God had created and to recognize that the reason why God had created is for a purpose of using it the right way and elevating it, that is the purpose of the whole creation and what we are doing here. So when, for example, we hear about the media, we hear about television, we hear about the internet, a lot of times a lot of us are a little bit taken back. This could be a disruptive tool. And no question, when misused, a person could sit and waste a whole day just watching TV and doing nothing with their lives. But these things could be used for holiness, to spread the word of God further. What many years ago, it was so limited. So in other words, you want to learn, you had to travel somewhere to learn. Now you could sit in your living room and watch a sermon, a talk, or something interesting that's going on, that it is positive. And that is using all the things that we have, as the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory always would say, to use it to be able to do for a lesson. As a simple example, as what we're doing right now. Being taped to be broadcast, hopefully the people could watch, and that will help them to advance in their Judaism or in them doing wonderful things and making this world a better world. That is the idea of all that. So let's look about what's happening in our section here, because we'll see this idea. So Yitro comes and he watches his son-in-law Moses, how Moses is working very hard. It says in the morning, Moses is sitting there and judging everyone, one person by himself, from the morning till evening. The father-in-law of Moses, Yitro, turns to him and says, "What are you doing? What is this that you're sitting all alone?" So Moses says, "Well, they come to me and I have to tell them the words of God." It's very interesting. In verse 17, it says, Moses' father-in-law said to him, "The thing that you are doing is not good. What you're doing is not good. Lo tov hadavar." There's only 2 times in the Bible that we find the word, "What you're doing is no good." Lo tov hadavar. In Genesis, we have the expression, God did not like certain behavior. He says, "Lo tov hadavar," it's not good. What over here is that it is not good? He says, because you won't be able to do it. And Yitro goes and tells him, "I have advice for you. Delegate. Delegate. Recognize that you are a human being and the human being's limitations. However, you are a godly person because you have special powers. How about you delegate, so then that could be distributed to everyone?" And he goes and gives them a plan. He gives them a plan. You should appoint people that will be in charge of 1,000s, people that will be in charge on 100s, people that will be in charge on 50s, and people that will be in charge on 10. So you have every 10 people, they have one person that they look up to. 50, another hierarchy. 100, 1,000. They should be in charge to help out, to judge the people, teach them, and anything that it is difficult, they will come to you. However, the minor things, they will take care of it. That will take off the load from you, and it'll be easier. If you do that, and he says, and God agrees to this plan, you'll be able to survive and everyone will be happy. It says Moses liked what he did, what he said, and he did that. He did exactly what he told him. Let's think a little bit about what's happening over here. There's a calculation. We're not going to go into this whole calculation. That amongst all the people of Israelites then, almost every 8th person had a job, was in charge. Because if you start thinking people in charge of 10, people in charge of 100, people in charge of 1,000, there's a calculation that almost every 8th person of the entire population had a role in leadership. So what's happening over here, and this is what God liked, because sometimes it has to come from below, from us, a very important point. Different than many other places, this is not dictatorship. Moses' way of leading the words of God is to create more leaders. And the more leaders there are, the more connection there is with the Almighty. So we have two things happening here. For one point, there's the limitation of the human being, and therefore what's difficult, you have to turn to Moses. So you're realizing from where everything is coming. You're not coming up with your ideas, with our own ideas. The base and the foundation is divine. It comes from God. However, we need to step up, each one of us, into a role of leadership that people look up to us to what we're doing. That is what has changed at Mount Sinai. And we see something very interesting later on. There's an interesting verse that says as follows. Right after the Ten Commandments, it says like this. This is on chapter 20, verse 15. It says, and all the people could see the sounds. All the people could see the sounds. Now we know you don't see the sounds, you hear the sounds. So what exactly is going on here? So we're going to follow one of the great sages, Rabbi Akiva, that says that what happened here was an unbelievable miracle. Things that we normally hear, they were able to see. And what you're usually able to see, they were able to hear. So what are they talking about? So first let's understand the difference between seeing and hearing. Seeing is usually a description when we talk about something physical. When you want to describe something physical, you say, I saw it. And when you see something, you're so sure about what you saw, and it's impossible to change the facts. You've seen it. When you hear something, to hear something is something that not necessarily you could see. So hearing is connected with something more distant, or as we would say, something more spiritual. So even the idea when you say, I understand something, and people will say, I see it, but really that idea of understanding, I hear. I hear it. You hear, you understand. So hearing, to hear something, you understand something, you hear it, but the capability of hearing is because it's distance, that's why you could hear. So something that is you could not see, I can't see the music, but I could hear it. Now imagine now if we live in a spiritual world, then you could step up and say, I see the music. Because you're so sure, it's so clear that you could see it. And therefore, a lot of times we even have that expression sometimes in English, as I said before, I see it. What, you see it? Not necessarily. It's so clear, I see the picture. It's so clear. So in other words, things that are distance become all of a sudden very clear. In our language will be things that are so spiritual and so removed and in a way don't look like we have any relation to it whatsoever. All of a sudden, they become close. They become that I could see it by practicing it and by being connected. This is what happened here. This section speaks about a phenomena that hasn't happened till then, and it says it will never happen again. A revelation of God to human beings. And one of the biggest proof that they talk about in the Kuzari, some of the books are familiar with the Kuzari, the revelation of God was not just to one individual. You find sometimes in different religions or in down history, somebody will say, I had a dream, a divine inspiration and things like this. But the divine inspiration was to one individual. So the one individual comes and says, I had a divine inspiration, he or she. And then you need to believe them. And hopefully they are up to what they're saying, and then maybe you could look up to them. Mount Sinai was, everybody was there. And that's what's the most important thing about the story here. And according to our sages, we're talking about over 3 million people standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, and there is a revelation of God. And all these people told their children. And their children told their children after that. So the revelation of God on Mount Sinai is something that went over in Jewish history so powerful that nobody was able to dispute that, because there were 3 million witnesses to this revelation. That is very powerful. And that is very important. Now, so God wanted to create a connection and a relationship. So that's the only time this happens, where he comes on Mount Sinai and reveals himself. That gave the strength to everyone, as it says, that they should be able to look up. Till that point, we're all human beings down here on earth, and basically, we have our 2 feet on the ground, hopefully, and that's what it is. As they always say, the difference between a human being and an animal is, one of the differences that the animal has their four legs on the ground, so that means they're always looking down. The human being could always look up. So we have the ability to look up. But here with Mount Sinai is more than that. God made for us accessible the idea of spirituality and the idea of feeling close. And at the same time, there's the distance. Because at the same time, he creates a border around the mountain. And he says, don't come close by. Don't touch. And in a way, this is a challenge for all the generations to come. That at the same time that there is closeness, there is also distance. You want to grow. If we want to grow in our relationship with God, we have to realize that there is a distance. And this distance allows us to grow. Because number one, we will never understand all God's ways. If we do, then we could play God. Never. We're never going to be able to understand. But at the same time, we realize the desire that we have all the time to get closer. So this is like almost an inside dispute that we have, or inside challenge that we have inside us about